The sun was setting over the pristine streets of Oakwood Heights, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the city of Westbrook. Officer Sarah Miller sat in her patrol car, sipping her third coffee of the evening shift. At 34 years old, she had spent 8 years on the force, and the last 3 specifically patrolling this wealthy area where houses started at $1 million. The residents of Oakwood Heights were predominantly white, and Officer Miller took what she called special pride in keeping the neighborhood safe. What she never admitted, even to herself, was how this safety often meant harassing people of color who had every right to be there. It was just past 7:30 p.m. when she noticed a black woman walking confidently down Cedar Avenue. The woman appeared to be in her mid-40s, wearing an expensive-looking navy blue business suit and carrying a leather briefcase. Despite the woman's professional appearance, Miller's prejudices immediately kicked in. "Something's not right," Miller muttered to herself, watching through her windshield as the woman checked her phone while walking. "These people don't live around here." Officer Miller started her patrol car and slowly drove alongside the woman. Dr. Angela Thompson, though she didn't know her identity yet, was actually returning from a long day at the state capitol. She had just finished leading an important legislative session on education reform, but to Miller, she was just another suspicious person. "Ma'am," Miller called out through her open window, "I need you to stop right there." Dr. Thompson looked up from her phone, initially confused but maintaining her composure. She'd faced similar situations before, despite her position as a state senator. She stopped walking and turned to face the officer with dignity. "Is there a problem, officer?" Dr. Thompson asked calmly, her voice carrying the confidence of someone used to speaking in legislative chambers. Miller stepped out of her patrol car, her hand resting unnecessarily on her holster. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area. What's your business here?" "I live here," Dr. Thompson replied simply, reaching for her purse to get her ID. "I'm just walking home from." "Don't move," Miller barked, her hand tightening on her weapon. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Several neighbors began peering through their windows at the commotion. Mrs. Peterson, who lived across the street, came out onto her porch, phone in hand, and began recording the interaction. "Officer, I'm merely trying to show you my identification," Dr. Thompson explained patiently, though her heart was racing. She had worked on police reform legislation and knew exactly how dangerous these situations could become. "Turn around and put your hands against the car," Miller demanded, her voice getting louder. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." This was a lie. There had been no reports, no descriptions, and no suspicious activity. But Miller, like many officers with ingrained biases, had become expert at manufacturing reasons for stops like these. Dr. Thompson, knowing her rights but also understanding the volatility of the situation, slowly complied. "I want to be clear, officer, that I'm complying under protest. I live at 425 Cedar Avenue, and I'm simply walking home." Miller roughly patted her down, finding nothing suspicious, just as there had been no reason for the stop in the first place. The leather briefcase Dr. Thompson had been carrying fell to the ground, spilling some papers marked with the state Senate letterhead, but Miller ignored them. "If you live here, what's the alarm code?" Miller demanded, another common tactic she used to trip people up. "I don't have to provide that information," Dr. Thompson replied firmly. "But I do have the right to show you my identification and to know why I'm being detained." Instead of acknowledging these rights, Miller pulled out her handcuffs. More neighbors had gathered now, several recording with their phones. The situation had escalated far beyond what was necessary, but Miller's prejudices and pride wouldn't let her back down. "You're being detained for suspicious activity and failure to comply with an officer's instructions," Miller announced loudly, more for the gathering crowd than for Dr. Thompson. As the cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, Dr. Thompson remained remarkably composed. She knew what was coming next, and while it wasn't how she planned to spend her evening, she also knew this encounter would soon teach Officer Miller a valuable lesson about assumptions and abuse of power. Little did Officer Sarah Miller know, she was about to handcuff one of the most powerful and respected state legislators in the region, and her whole world was about to be turned upside down. The police cruiser's lights flashed brightly in the darkening evening as Officer Miller forced Dr. Thompson into the back seat. By now, at least a dozen residents had gathered on their lawns, many recording the incident on their phones. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "This is completely unnecessary," Dr. Thompson said calmly from the back seat. "My ID is in my purse, and my house keys are in my pocket. You're making a serious mistake, Officer Miller." Miller ignored her, instead roughly gathering Dr. Thompson's scattered belongings from the ground. She stuffed the briefcase and purse into a paper evidence bag without even glancing at their contents. The state Senate papers that had fallen out were carelessly shoved in as well, their official letterheads and seals going unnoticed in Miller's haste. As Miller got into the driver's seat, Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor who had first started recording, approached the car. "Officer, there's been a mistake. That's Dr. Thompson. She lives right there." She pointed frantically at the beautiful colonial house just 3 doors down. "Ma'am, step back from the vehicle," Miller barked. "This is police business. If you interfere, you'll be arrested too." Inside the car, Dr. Thompson took slow, measured breaths. In her 15 years as a state legislator, she had helped write laws about police conduct and racial profiling. Now she was experiencing firsthand what countless others had gone through. She made mental notes of every procedure Miller was violating, knowing this would soon become a teachable moment. The drive to the police station took 20 minutes. During this time, Miller tried to provoke Dr. Thompson with questions designed to trip her up. "So, if you live in that neighborhood, where's the nearest grocery store? What color is your neighbor's house? When did you supposedly move in?" Dr. Thompson answered each question precisely but added, "Officer, I can see what you're doing. This type of questioning has no legal basis, and you know it." At the station, Miller marched Dr. Thompson through the front doors like she had caught a dangerous criminal. Several officers looked up from their desks, surprised to see such a well-dressed woman in handcuffs. Sergeant James Rodriguez, Miller's supervisor, immediately noticed something wasn't right about this arrest. "Miller, what's going on here?" Rodriguez asked, his experienced eyes taking in Dr. Thompson's professional appearance and dignified bearing. "Suspicious person in Oakwood Heights, refusing to identify herself," Miller reported smugly. "Probably casing houses or running some kind of scam." Dr. Thompson spoke up, her voice clear and authoritative despite the circumstances. "Sergeant, I'm Dr. Angela Thompson, State Senator for District 12. Your officer refused to check my identification and arrested me while I was walking to my home on Cedar Avenue." The color drained from Sergeant Rodriguez's face. He knew exactly who Dr. Thompson was. Her picture hung in the station's lobby, taken during a police reform bill signing ceremony last year. "Miller, remove those handcuffs immediately." Miller scoffed, still not getting it. "Sir, she's obviously lying." "There's no way." "Check her ID right now," Rodriguez ordered sharply. With obvious reluctance, Miller opened the evidence bag and pulled out Dr. Thompson's purse. The first thing she found was a state Senate identification card with Dr. Thompson's photo and credentials. Behind it was her driver's license showing her Cedar Avenue address. The realization hit Miller like a bucket of ice water. She had just illegally arrested one of the most influential state senators, the chair of the Law Enforcement Oversight Committee, no less. Her hands began to shake as she removed the handcuffs. "Senator Thompson, I cannot apologize enough," Sergeant Rodriguez began, but Dr. Thompson held up her hand. "Sergeant, I'd like to file a formal complaint," she said firmly. "And I want all body camera footage preserved. Officer Miller's conduct tonight represents exactly the kind of biased policing my committee has been working to eliminate." Miller stood frozen, her career flashing before her eyes. The senator she had just arrested had the power to influence police department policies across the entire state. Through her own prejudice and arrogance, she had just created a nightmare situation for herself and her department. As other officers scrambled to offer Dr. Thompson coffee and a private room to make calls, Miller slumped into a nearby chair, finally understanding the magnitude of her mistake. But this was only the beginning of what would become the most challenging and transformative period of her career. News of Senator Thompson's wrongful arrest spread like wildfire through the police station. Within an hour, Police Chief Robert Martinez rushed in, still wearing his dinner suit. His face was tight with concern as he hurried to the conference room where Dr. Thompson was waiting. Meanwhile, Officer Miller sat alone in the break room, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee. The videos from Cedar Avenue had already hit social media. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications, friends and family sending her links to Twitter and Facebook posts showing her aggressive arrest of the senator. The hashtag Officer Miller must go was already trending locally. What do you have to say for yourself? Sergeant Rodriguez demanded, entering the break room. He slapped a thick file on the table. Do you know what I found when I pulled your stop records? In the past year, you've stopped 245 people in Oakwood Heights. Want to guess the racial breakdown of those stops? Miller stared at her coffee, unable to meet his eyes. She knew the numbers wouldn't look good. 87% were people of color, Rodriguez continued, his voice tight with anger. In a neighborhood that's less than 10% minority. Care to explain that, Miller? Before she could respond, another officer rushed in. You guys need to see this. The body cam footage is all over the news. In the conference room, Senator Thompson sat composed and dignified as she spoke on the phone with the governor. Chief Martinez hovered nearby, his face growing paler by the minute as he listened to her side of the conversation. No, Governor, I don't want her fired, Dr. Thompson was saying. That would be too easy. What I want is systematic change. This incident is going to be a catalyst for real reform. The station's TV showed various news channels playing Miller's body camera footage on split screens alongside cell phone videos taken by neighbors. The footage was damning, showing Miller's aggressive approach, her refusal to check ID, and her manufactured excuses for the stop. Political commentators were already discussing the incident. This is what Black Americans have been talking about. If a state senator can be treated this way in front of her own home, imagine what ordinary citizens face. Chief Martinez finally got his chance to speak with Senator Thompson. Senator, on behalf of the entire department, I want to express our deepest. Save it, Chief. Dr. Thompson interrupted firmly but professionally. I've spent years trying to work with law enforcement to address these issues. I've heard all the apologies before. What I haven't seen is real change. But now, thanks to Officer Miller's actions, everyone can see exactly what we've been talking about. Down the hall, internal affairs investigators were already setting up in an interview room. Miller watched through the break room window as more senior officers arrived. Many called back from their evening plans. The gravity of her situation was finally sinking in. Officer Miller, a stern voice called. Lieutenant Sarah Chen from Internal Affairs stood in the doorway. We need to talk about your actions tonight. The interview was grueling. Every decision, every word Miller had spoken was scrutinized. Why did she really stop Dr. Thompson? What made a well-dressed woman walking in an upscale neighborhood suspicious? How did she justify escalating to handcuffs without checking ID? I thought, Miller stammered, but her usual excuses sounded hollow even to her own ears. You thought what, Officer Miller? Lieutenant Chen pressed. That black people don't belong in Oakwood Heights? That they must be criminals? That's not thinking. That's prejudice, and it's cost this department dearly. Outside the station, news fans were starting to gather. Local activists were already organizing a protest for the morning. Social media was exploding with new videos, including security footage from nearby houses showing Dr. Thompson's dignified composure throughout the ordeal. By midnight, the story had gone national. Morning shows were already booking interviews with civil rights leaders and police reform experts. Dr. Thompson's office released a brief statement. Tonight's incident demonstrates why we need meaningful police reform. Tomorrow, I will introduce new legislation to address racial profiling and police accountability. Miller, finally allowed to check her phone again, scrolled through countless angry messages and comments. Her sister, a teacher, had texted, Sarah, how could you? Dr. Thompson spoke at our school last year. She's one of the most respected people in the state. As the night wore on, Miller began to realize this wasn't going to blow over. Her actions hadn't just embarrassed the department. They had become a symbol of everything wrong with biased policing. And whether she was ready or not, both she and her department were about to face a very public reckoning. The next morning, the scene outside the police station resembled a media circus. News vans lined the street, and reporters clutched coffee cups while doing live broadcasts for morning shows. A crowd of protesters had already gathered, holding signs that read Justice for Senator Thompson and End Police Racism Now. Inside her office, Chief Martinez was holding an emergency meeting with the mayor and city council members. The department's public relations team worked frantically to handle the hundreds of media requests pouring in, but the real storm was brewing in the state capitol building. Senator Thompson stood at the podium in the main legislative chamber, her composed demeanor a stark contrast to the previous night's humiliation. Every seat was filled, and the gallery overflowed with journalists and citizens eager to hear her speak. "Last night," she began, her voice steady and clear, "I experienced what countless Black Americans face every day, but unlike many of them, I have the power to do something about it. Today, I'm introducing the Police Accountability and Community Trust Act." Meanwhile, Officer Miller sat in her small apartment, watching the live broadcast with growing dread. She hadn't slept all night, and her eyes were red from crying. Her uniform hung untouched on its hook. She'd been placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. Her phone rang for the 100th time that morning. This time it was her mother. "Sarah, honey," her mother's voice cracked. "Your grandfather just called. He saw everything on the news. He's so disappointed. You know he marched with Dr. King, right? He said he never thought his own granddaughter would." Miller couldn't bear to hear more. She hung up the phone and turned back to the TV, where Senator Thompson was still speaking. "This isn't about revenge," the senator continued. "It's about transformation. Officer Miller's actions weren't just her own. They represent a systemic problem. Today, we have an opportunity to address that problem." The proposed legislation was comprehensive. It called for mandatory bias training, community oversight boards, and regular audits of officers' stop patterns. But what caught everyone's attention was the innovative approach to officer rehabilitation. Officers found to have exhibited racial bias will not be immediately terminated, Senator Thompson explained. Instead, they'll undergo an intensive 6-month program working directly with community members, civil rights organizations, and families affected by police misconduct. Back at the station, Sergeant Rodriguez was reviewing Miller's complete record. The pattern was undeniable, not just in her stops and arrests, but in her written reports. The language she used to describe minority subjects was consistently more hostile and suspicious than her descriptions of white civilians. Internal Affairs had set up a special task force to handle the case. Lieutenant Chen's team had already interviewed 12 residents of Oakwood Heights who came forward with similar stories about Miller. "Look at this," Chen said, showing Rodriguez a stack of complaints. 3 months ago, she stopped a black pediatrician coming home from an emergency shift. 2 weeks before that, it was a Hispanic judge's wife. The pattern is crystal clear. The mayor's office released a statement supporting Senator Thompson's proposed legislation and announcing an independent review of the entire department's practices. But they'd also faced a difficult decision about Officer Miller's future. In her apartment, Miller watched as clips from her body camera played on national news. She saw herself through new eyes, the hostility in her voice, the unnecessary aggression, the obvious prejudice in her actions. For the first time, she couldn't hide from the truth about herself. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sergeant Rodriguez. "Senator Thompson's office called. She wants to meet with you tomorrow. It's your choice, but I strongly suggest you accept." Miller stared at the message for a long time. Part of her wanted to resign, move away, and try to forget this nightmare. But a smaller, braver part of her knew she needed to face this head-on. She typed back, "I'll be there." As the day went down, the story showed no signs of fading. Social media erupted with old videos of Senator Thompson's previous speeches about police reform, contrasted with footage from her arrest. The incident was becoming a defining moment in the national conversation about race and policing. Miller turned off her TV and sat in the darkness of her apartment, wondering how she would face tomorrow. She didn't know it yet, but her meeting with Senator Thompson would change not just her career, but her entire understanding of justice, privilege, and the true meaning of protecting and serving all members of the community. The meeting was set for 9 a.m. in Senator Thompson's office at the state capitol. Officer Miller arrived 30 minutes early, wearing civilian clothes, a simple blue blazer and black pants. Her hands trembled as she sat in the waiting area, watching staffers hurry past with papers and phones. The senator's office walls were lined with photographs chronicling her 20 years of public service. One picture showed her receiving a law degree from Harvard. Another captured her swearing-in ceremony as a state senator. Miller noticed a recent photo of Thompson at a police academy graduation, giving a speech about community policing. Officer Miller, the senator's assistant, called. Dr. Thompson will see you now. Inside the spacious office, Senator Thompson sat behind a large desk, looking as composed as ever. Two other people were present. Dr. James Wilson, a renowned expert on racial bias training, and Maria Ramirez, the head of the Community Oversight Board. Please, sit down, Senator Thompson gestured to a chair. Miller noticed it was positioned so she wouldn't feel cornered, a small act of consideration she didn't deserve. Before we begin, Thompson said, pulling out a familiar-looking file, I'd like to show you something. She opened it to reveal dozens of letters. These arrived at my office yesterday. They're from other people you've stopped in Oakwood Heights. Miller's throat went dry. She'd expected accusations and anger, but the senator's calm demeanor was somehow worse. Patricia Martinez, a neurosurgeon, Thompson read from one letter. Stopped while jogging. Marcus Williams, a high school principal, stopped while walking his dog. Robert Chen, a retired judge, stopped while gardening in his own front yard. She looked up at Miller. Notice any patterns? They're all minorities, Miller whispered, her voice barely audible. Yes, Thompson nodded. But there's something else. They're all professionals, all legitimate residents, all stopped for looking suspicious in their own neighborhood, just like me. Dr. Wilson leaned forward. Officer Miller, do you know what implicit bias is? Before Miller could answer, Senator Thompson raised her hand. Actually, I'd like to try something different. She pressed her intercom. Send them in, please. The office door opened, and 3 people entered, the same people from the letters. Dr. Martinez, Principal Williams, and Judge Chen walked in, each carrying their own stories of humiliation and fear. Officer Miller, Senator Thompson said, today you're going to listen, really listen, not as a police officer, but as a human being. For the next 2 hours, Miller heard their stories. Dr. Martinez described how her children now feared police after watching their mother being handcuffed in their driveway. Principal Williams explained how he had to counsel students who'd lost faith in law enforcement after his incident. Judge Chen, at 70 years old, shared how he no longer felt safe gardening in his own yard. Miller found herself crying, not from self-pity this time, but from genuine shame and regret. The walls she built to justify her actions were crumbling. I don't know what to say, she finally managed. That's good, Maria Ramirez spoke for the first time, because right now, your job is to listen and learn. Senator Thompson stood up and walked to her window, overlooking the city. Officer Miller, I'm offering you a choice. You can resign, move away, try to forget this happened. Or, you can be part of the solution. She turned back to face Miller. My new legislation includes a pilot program. Officers with documented bias incidents will work directly with community members, undergo intensive training, and learn from those they've wronged. It's not punishment, it's rehabilitation. Are you interested? Miller looked around the room at the faces of people she had hurt through her actions. She saw not anger, but a willingness to help her change. It was more than she deserved. Yes, she said firmly, for the first time that day. I want to do better. I need to do better. Good. Senator Thompson smiled slightly. Because starting next week, you'll be working with everyone in this room. You'll learn about implicit bias from Dr. Wilson, community relations from Ms. Ramirez, and most importantly, you'll learn from the very community members you've hurt. As Miller left the Capitol building that afternoon, she felt something she hadn't expected. Hope. The road ahead would be difficult and humbling, but for the first time, she was ready to confront her biases and truly learn what it meant to protect and serve all members of her community. 3 months into Senator Thompson's pilot rehabilitation program, Officer Miller found herself sitting in a community center in Oakwood Heights. The same neighborhood where her prejudiced actions had once caused so much pain was now becoming her classroom for change. Tonight's session was particularly challenging. The room was filled with 30 teenagers, all part of a youth leadership program. Many were children of the same residents she had wrongfully stopped over the years. Among them was Dr. Martinez's 16-year-old daughter, Sophia, who couldn't look Miller in the eye. Officer Miller, Dr. Wilson announced to the group, is here to share her journey of transformation. But first, we want to hear from you. How has police bias affected your lives? One by one, the teenagers stood up and shared their stories. Stories of watching their parents being humiliated, of changing their routes to school to avoid police, of being taught at a young age how to act less threatening to law enforcement. Sophia finally raised her hand. "I used to want to be a police officer," she said, her voice trembling. "But after seeing what happened to my mom, I don't anymore. How can I be part of a system that treats people like that?" Miller felt the familiar sting of shame, but Dr. Wilson had taught her not to hide from these feelings. Instead, she needed to use them as motivation for change. "Sophia," Miller spoke softly, "your mother is one of the bravest people I've met. She didn't just share her story with me, she helped me understand why I was wrong. Maybe we need more people like you in law enforcement, people who understand what needs to change." Meanwhile, across town at the state capitol, Senator Thompson was presenting the first progress report on her police reform program. The media room was packed with journalists and lawmakers. "In just 3 months," Thompson announced, "we've seen a 40% decrease in racially motivated stops in participating precincts. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Real change happens one person at a time." She clicked to a slide showing Miller working with community members, attending bias training sessions, and participating in youth programs. Officer Miller's case has become a model for our rehabilitation approach. Instead of punishment alone, we're creating understanding. Back at the community center, the session had turned interactive. The teenagers were role-playing police encounters, with Miller providing insight into proper procedures and their rights as citizens. "An officer can't stop you just because you look suspicious," Miller explained, the words tasting bitter in her mouth as she remembered her own past actions. "They need reasonable suspicion of a specific crime." After the session, Sophia approached Miller. "My mom says you're different now," she said hesitantly. "She says you're really trying to change." Miller nodded. "I am. But I know it doesn't erase what I did." "No," Sophia agreed, "but maybe it can prevent it from happening to someone else." That evening, Miller had her weekly check-in with Maria Ramirez from the Community Oversight Board. They met at a local coffee shop, where many residents now recognized Miller not as the officer who had harassed their neighbors, but as someone working to make amends. "Your progress reports are encouraging," Ramirez said, reviewing her notes. "Dr. Wilson says your understanding of implicit bias has improved significantly. The community feedback is mostly positive, but there's still work to do." Miller agreed. Each day brought new challenges and revelations. She'd started keeping a journal of her experiences, documenting her transformation from an officer who saw threats based on skin color to someone learning to truly protect and serve her community. As she drove home that night, Miller passed the spot where she had wrongfully arrested Senator Thompson. The memory no longer filled her with just shame. It also reminded her of how far she'd come and how far she still needed to go. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Martinez. Sophia came home talking about the youth session. "Thank you for being honest with them. Small steps make big changes." Miller smiled slightly, remembering Senator Thompson's words from 3 months ago. "This isn't about punishment, it's about transformation." For the first time, she truly understood what that meant. She pulled into her driveway, noticing her neighbor, an elderly black man, working in his garden. 3 months ago, she might have viewed him with suspicion. Tonight, she waved and called out, "Those roses are looking beautiful, Mr. Johnson." The journey wasn't over, but step by step, day by day, Officer Sarah Miller was becoming the kind of police officer she should have been all along. 6 months had passed since the infamous arrest, and the Police Accountability and Community Trust Act was showing remarkable results across the state. Today was Officer Miller's final evaluation, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The evaluation committee gathered in a conference room at police headquarters. Senator Thompson sat at the head of the table, flanked by Dr. Wilson, Maria Ramirez, and Chief Martinez. The room was also filled with community members who had been part of Miller's rehabilitation journey. "Officer Miller," Senator Thompson began, opening a thick folder, "over the past 6 months, you've undergone extensive training, community service, and personal development. Today, we'll review your progress and decide your future with the department." Miller sat straight in her chair, her hands folded on the table. She looked different now, not just in her demeanor, but in the way she carried herself. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence built on understanding and empathy. Dr. Wilson presented first. showing charts of Miller's progress through the bias training program. Officer Miller's transformation has been remarkable, he explained. Her incident reports now show no racial bias in language or decision-making. More importantly, she's become an advocate for change within the department. Maria Ramirez shared feedback from community members. In the beginning, many residents were skeptical, she admitted, but Officer Miller has earned their trust through consistent actions and genuine engagement. Chief Martinez added his perspective. She's been conducting voluntary training sessions for other officers, sharing her experience and helping them recognize their own biases. Her story has become a powerful tool for departmental change. Then came the community testimonials. Dr. Martinez spoke about how Miller had become a regular volunteer at her hospital's youth health program. Principal Williams described her work with his students in creating a police-youth dialogue program. Even Sophia, who once feared police, talked about Miller's influence in changing her perspective on law enforcement. Judge Chen, now a close mentor to Miller, spoke last. When Officer Miller stopped me in my garden that day, I saw nothing but prejudice in her eyes. Today, I see someone who has done the hard work of confronting their biases and choosing to change. Finally, it was Miller's turn to speak. She stood up, taking a deep breath. 6 months ago, I was a different person, she began. I had convinced myself that my prejudices were good policing. Senator Thompson's arrest didn't just expose my bias, it forced me to confront the damage I've been doing to this community. She turned to face the room. I learned that good policing isn't about power or control. It's about service, understanding, and trust. Every day, I work to earn back the trust I broke. I know this journey doesn't end today. Senator Thompson studied Miller carefully. Officer Miller, your progress has been significant. However, we need to ensure this change is permanent. What would you say to an officer who thinks this program is just about appeasing public opinion? Miller didn't hesitate. I tell them they're wrong. This isn't about public relations. It's about being better officers and better human beings. I'd show them my journal, where I documented every revelation, every uncomfortable truth I had to face. I tell them that confronting your own bias is the hardest but most important work you can do. The committee took a short break to deliberate. When they returned, Senator Thompson delivered their decision. Officer Miller, based on your demonstrated growth and commitment to change, we are recommending your return to full active duty, she announced. However, with some new responsibilities. The senator outlined the plan. Miller would become one of the department's first bias prevention and community relations officers. She would help implement similar training programs across the state, using her own experience to guide other officers through the process of recognition and change. Your story, Senator Thompson concluded, proves that meaningful change is possible when we choose education over punishment, understanding over judgment. As the meeting ended, Miller found herself surrounded by the very community members she had once viewed with suspicion. They weren't just faces in her patrol area anymore, they were partners in creating a better kind of policing. Outside the building, reporters waited to hear about the evaluation results. But before facing the media, Miller took a moment to send a text to her grandfather. "You be proud now, Grandpa. I finally understand what you fought for all those years ago." The journey that began with a wrongful arrest was transforming not just one officer, but an entire approach to community policing. And for Sarah Miller, it was only the beginning. 1 year to the day after the fateful arrest, Officer Sarah Miller stood at a podium in the state capitol's main hall. Behind her sat Senator Thompson, along with dozens of community leaders, police officers, and citizens who had been part of her transformation journey. The occasion was the first annual Police and Community Trust Conference, an event born from the legislation that Senator Thompson had introduced after her arrest. Police departments from across the country had sent representatives to learn about the successful rehabilitation program. A year ago, Miller began, her voice steady and clear. "I made a terrible mistake born from deep-seated prejudice. I wrongfully arrested Senator Thompson outside her own home because I couldn't believe a black woman belonged in that neighborhood." The room was silent, hundreds of eyes fixed on her. "Today, I'm a different person, not because I was punished, but because I was given the chance to learn, to understand, and to change. This program didn't just save my career, it saved my humanity." In the audience, Sophia Martinez, now a high school senior, sat next to her mother, Dr. Martinez. Sophia had recently announced her decision to attend the police academy after graduation, inspired by the change she witnessed in Miller and the department. Chief Martinez presented the year's statistics. Racial profiling incidents had dropped by 75% across participating precincts. Civilian complaints were down, and community trust scores had reached historic highs. Other states were beginning to adopt similar programs. When it was Senator Thompson's turn to speak, she invited Miller to stand beside her. Officer Miller's story could have ended with her dismissal, the senator said. Instead, it became a catalyst for genuine change. Today, she trains other officers, works with our youth, and helps build bridges between law enforcement and communities of color. Miller's grandfather, now 85, sat in the front row, tears streaming down his face. He wore the same medal he received for his civil rights work in the 1960s. His granddaughter had finally become part of the solution he fought for all those years ago. After the main ceremony, there was a smaller gathering in the Capitol's garden. Here, Miller met with many of the residents she'd wrongfully stopped in Oakwood Heights. But now, instead of fear and resentment, there was respect and even friendship. Judge Chen approached her with a smile. "Remember when you stopped me in my garden?" he asked. "Now look at us, planning community outreach programs together." The media covered the event extensively. National news networks interviewed Miller about her journey from being a symbol of police racism to becoming an advocate for change. But the most meaningful moment came when a young black officer from another state approached her. "I almost quit the force last year," he told her. "I couldn't stand watching my colleagues profile people who looked like my family, but your story, it gives me hope that things can change." Later that evening, Miller and Senator Thompson walked together down Cedar Avenue, the same street where everything had changed a year ago. They stopped in front of the senator's house. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" Miller asked. Senator Thompson smiled. "Actually, I did. The night you arrested me, I saw something in you, not just prejudice, but potential. That's why I fought for rehabilitation instead of punishment." As they talked, a patrol car drove by slowly. The officer inside waved respectfully at both women. It was a small moment, but it symbolized how much had changed. Back at her office, Miller looked at the wall where she'd hung her most important photos: her grandfather at civil rights marches, her graduation from the rehabilitation program, and a picture of her with the youth police academy she now helped run. Among them was her old badge, a reminder of who she used to be. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophia Martinez. "Thanks for helping me tell my parents about the police academy. See you at tomorrow's youth program." Miller smiled, remembering Senator Thompson's words from a year ago. This isn't about revenge. It's about transformation. As she prepared to leave for the day, Miller checked her schedule for tomorrow. Morning briefing with new officers about bias prevention, lunch meeting with community leaders, an afternoon session with the youth program. Her life had become dedicated to preventing others from making the same mistakes she had made. The story of a racist cop and a state senator had transformed into something much bigger, a model for change, a testament to the power of education over punishment, and proof that even the deepest biases could be overcome with understanding, effort, and the courage to change. The end.